The courtroom fell silent as Judge Frank Caprio's gavel hovered just above the wooden block. All eyes, from the polished brass chandelier overhead to the worn benches where spectators sat, fixed on the figure standing before the bench. An elderly man, stooped but dignified, gripped his worn fedora with trembling fingers. Rumors had swirled through Providence for weeks. The U.S. administration had uncovered a hidden cache of $100 million in this man's modest home. Whispers of betrayal, secret trusts, and forgotten loyalties drifted through the crowd. Then, as Caprio's kind eyes met the old man's weary gaze, something astonishing happened. A single photograph slid across the prosecutor's table, revealing the man cradling a long-lost war hero decades earlier. A shiver ran through the room. How did a humble grandfatherly figure amass such a fortune? And how was that fortune tied to a vow made to save lives in a forgotten battlefield? As the gavel came down, Caprio's voice, steady yet soft, invited the first witness forward. And in that moment, everyone sensed that this case would not be an ordinary ledger of ledgers and line items. It would reveal something far deeper, a story of sacrifice, honor, and an administration's moral reckoning. Before we dive deeper into this courtroom drama, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our latest stories from Judge Caprio's compassionate court. The oak doors to the courtroom swung open with a gentle creak, and in stepped Seamus O'Malley. At 82, his back was slightly stooped, but there was a dignity in his posture that caught everyone's attention. His dark suit, though faded around the seams, was meticulously pressed, clearly the work of an old hand who respected tradition. Tucked under his arm was a battered leather satchel, the corners worn and softened from years of handling. The satchel seemed almost like an extension of himself, carrying not just papers, but memories. As Seamus made his way to the defense table, he offered nods and soft smiles to onlookers, an old friend from the Vietnam era seated in the back, a young woman taking notes methodically, and a reporter with a pen poised over her notepad. His fedora, held carefully in his left hand, revealed a shock of white hair that caught the morning light. A few strands fell over his forehead, giving him a boyish, almost mischievous look beneath those weathered eyes. Clara Ortiz, his attorney, rose to greet him. Despite her own nerves, she gave him a reassuring nod. "Morning, Mr. O'Malley," she murmured, cool and calm. He tapped the side of her arm lightly with his satchel. "Morning, Clara. Ready to set the record straight?" he replied, his voice a gravelly whisper, but laced with quiet confidence. Judge Caprio, seated on the bench, leaned forward as Seamus approached. "Mr. O'Malley, I trust your glasses are in good working order." Caprio's tone was warm, tinged with a gentle humor that put everyone at ease. Seamus patted his breast pocket. "Right here, Your Honor, and maybe a brief confession, though I hope that's not needed." The question drew a soft chuckle from the courtroom. From the gallery, the rustling of reporters' cameras and the soft murmur of spectators faded as all eyes focused on the old man. Seamus gave a small, almost shy smile, then placed his satchel on the table, set his fedora aside, and raised his chin in readiness. In that moment, he looked every bit the part of a humble veteran ready to tell his side of a story that had carried him more than 7 decades. Special Agent Renee Caldwell rose from the witness stand, her polished black shoes clicking softly on the courtroom's marble floor. The afternoon sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating her crisp uniform and the badge that marked her authority. A hush settled over the gallery as she adjusted the microphone. Judge Caprio inclined his head slightly, inviting her testimony. "Agent Caldwell," Clara Ortiz began, "could you please explain to the court how you discovered the assets linked to Mr. O'Malley?" Caldwell straightened her shoulders. "Your Honor, It began as a routine audit of federal contracts related to emergency medical supplies during the Korean War. My team was examining records from the 1950s, payments made for bandages, antibiotics, surgical kits. We noticed an entry signed by a private first-class Seamus O'Malley for approximately $5 million in 1952. The problem was that the Department of Defense's own logistics reports indicate that another contractor provided those supplies at market prices. There was no record of O'Malley's unit requesting additional payments. In short, those funds appeared to be overpayments funneled to shell companies bearing Mr. O'Malley's name. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Caprio raised his hand to restore order. "Continue, Agent Caldwell." As we followed the paper trail, Caldwell explained, we discovered that those initial payments were routed into a trust labeled O'Malley Health Trust, supposedly established for veteran care. However, the trust did not make any charitable disbursements after 1965. Instead, the assets were reinvested: stocks, bonds, real estate. By the time today's audit was conducted, the original $5 million had grown to nearly $100 million, accounting for compound interest and market fluctuations. We traced properties in Florida and Delaware, as well as dormant offshore accounts in the Virgin Islands. Clara Ortiz nodded, pen poised over her notes. "Agent Caldwell, have you confirmed whether any of those funds actually returned to the Department of Defense or were otherwise used for veteran care?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. "No, counsel. We found no bank records, charitable receipts, or evidence of legitimate expenditures. When we searched the archives of the department's Veterans Assistance Programs, there was no record of the O'Malley Health Trust's disbursements. It appears those funds simply remained idle, or were redirected into personal investments unknown to federal authorities." Clara exchanged a glance with Seamus, who sat at the defense table, his hands folded in his lap. Though his posture remained erect, his knuckles were visibly white around the edges. After a moment, Clara rose again. "Agent Caldwell, you mentioned shell companies. Could you provide examples of these entities and how they connected back to Mr. O'Malley?" Caldwell pulled out a binder and flipped through pages of documents. She passed a set of photocopies to the bailiff, who placed them before Judge Caprio. "Exhibit 3, she said, is the incorporation paperwork for O'Malley Shipping and Supplies, LLC, dated June 1952, registered in Delaware. Exhibit 4 is the ledger showing disbursements and transfers from that LLC to various brokerage accounts in Tokyo and London. All of these transactions bear Mr. O'Malley's signature or were authorized through proxies linked to him." A hush fell again. The gallery members leaned forward, scanning the documents. Judge Caprio peered through his spectacles. "Agent Caldwell, it appears you are saying that Mr. O'Malley created at least one corporate entity during the war, O'Malley Shipping and Supplies, and that entity received government funds." Caldwell nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We also uncovered a document labeled Directive 17B from a Tokyo-based Red Cross affiliate, acknowledging a transfer of funds to O'Malley-related accounts. Yet there is no indication these funds were used for any humanitarian purpose after 1965. Instead, we traced the money into mutual funds and real estate, luxury condominiums in Miami Beach, land plots in Cape May. None of the properties generated charitable activity." Seamus's lips quivered slightly, and Clara placed her hand gently on his arm to show her support. When Clara turned back to Caldwell, the agent continued. "Furthermore, we conducted interviews with the surviving members of his old unit, most of whom recall him as a dedicated medic, but none recall him ever admitting to receiving payments. They believed he was handling supplies out of pocket or receiving donations from NGOs. There is no recollection in the official logs of any government-sanctioned overpayment to Mr. O'Malley." Judge Caprio's brow furrowed. Does that imply Mr. O'Malley may have been unaware of the financial trail his actions created? Caldwell hesitated before answering. Potentially. However, by federal law, ignorance does not automatically absolve one from accountability, especially when trust funds reach such a staggering amount. Clara immediately seized the opportunity to question. Agent Caldwell, in your audit, did you find any evidence that Mr. O'Malley attempted to keep detailed accounting records or to notify authorities of the existence of these accounts during his lifetime? Caldwell tapped a clear divider in her binder. No direct evidence of proactive disclosure. We did find correspondence, one letter from Mr. O'Malley to the Department of Defense in October 1954, requesting guidance on how to manage surplus funds. Unfortunately, there was no response from DoD. Subsequent correspondence exists, but those letters suggest confusion and a lack of clarity, as if he believed the funds were held in trust for emergencies. Clara nodded, then asked, Agent Caldwell, could you please describe the moment when these records resurfaced in 2018? How did Mr. O'Malley become aware of the $100 million trust? Caldwell flipped a page to reveal an email chain from the Department of Treasury. In March 2018, the Unclaimed Property Division issued a notification to the last known address of Mr. O'Malley. He was informed that dormant accounts registered under his name had been flagged as unclaimed property. We believe he received that notice, which then triggered this investigation. At this point, Monroe, the prosecuting attorney, rose to cross-examine. He buttoned his suit jacket, each movement precise. Agent Caldwell, you rely heavily on historical documents, but testimony from the witnesses indicates that Mr. O'Malley thought he was acting in the best interests of his fellow soldiers. Are you suggesting that veterans who acted without formal documentation should be held accountable to the same standards as large corporate contractors? Caldwell tilted her head. Sir, federal law is clear. Any individual or entity receiving government funds under a contract must provide accurate financial records. If Mr. O'Malley did not comply, he cannot now claim a waiver because he believed his actions were noble. He is subject to the law like any other civilian contractor. Monroe's eyes flicked toward the judge. Your Honor, the issue at hand is straightforward. Mr. O'Malley received $5 million in 1952, and through investments and lack of transparent accounting, those funds have ballooned into a $100 million trust. It matters little what his intentions were. The funds are the government's unclaimed property. Clara rose again to object. Your Honor, may I point out that Mr. O'Malley attempted to notify the proper channels decades ago? His letters from 1954 exist as Exhibit 7. They clearly show he was seeking instructions to transfer any surplus to veteran care. If the Department of Defense had responded or provided guidance, perhaps this situation never would have occurred. Judge Caprio tapped his gavel lightly. I'll allow discussion of those letters. However, let's stay focused on facts. Agent Caldwell, you have no direct evidence that Mr. O'Malley personally profited from these funds, correct? Caldwell flicked her gaze toward the ledger entries. No, Your Honor. We have evidence he authorized transfers, but nothing indicates he deposited checks into his personal checking account. The balances appear to have been reinvested, which could constitute usage as an investment tool, rather than direct personal enrichment. Judge Caprio nodded and turned to Clara. Ms. Ortiz, if you wish to call your next witness, you may. But I'd like to hear more about these letters from 1954 and 1957, what they contain, and why they went unanswered. Clara motioned for the clerk to bring forward the letters and invited the court to examine them. The clerk carefully placed sealed envelopes onto the defense table. Clara opened the first, handing a typed letter to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Letter dated June 12, 1954, addressed to the Department of Defense, Clara read aloud. It states, I write to inquire regarding surplus funds credited to my account for supplies obtained for the 24th Infantry Division. My intention is to transfer any remaining balances to support medical care for disabled veterans. Please advise on the proper procedures. Respectfully, Seamus O'Malley, Private First Class, U.S. Army. A hush fell over the courtroom again. Seamus shifted in his seat, clasping his hands over his heart. Clara continued. Letter dated October 3, 1957. Sir, 3 years have passed since my last communication. The so-called O'Malley Health Trust has grown, yet I have received no guidance. I remain a postal clerk, and my family struggles. If these funds truly belong to the government, I will arrange their return. Please provide instructions. Sincerely, Seamus O'Malley. Judge Caprio held the letters, scanning the dates and signatures. He exchanged a glance with the prosecution table. Monroe cleared his throat. Your Honor, these are compelling, but they do not constitute official notification from the Department of Defense. The fact is, Mr. O'Malley never received a reply, either because his letters were lost in bureaucratic limbo or disregarded. Caprio looked back at Seamus. Mr. O'Malley, what prompted you to stop writing these letters after 1957? Did you assume your queries were ignored, or did you feel resolved that any funds belonged to veteran care? Seamus exhaled through his nose, eyes misted. I assumed it simply wasn't a priority for them. I thought maybe they didn't believe a private soldier's letters should interrupt official business. I cared more about getting back home and rebuilding my life. Over the decades, I thought the trust was something the government managed. It was only in 2018 that I realized it was all still under my name. Caprio nodded, placing the letters down gingerly. He then turned to Monroe. Any further questions about these letters? Monroe shook his head. No, Your Honor. We concede that the letters exist, but we maintain that the lack of official communication does not absolve responsibility. Caprio tapped his pen on the bench. Very well. Agent Caldwell, do you have anything more to add before we move on to Sergeant Major Kimball's testimony? Caldwell closed her binder. Only that, in the absence of documented guidance from DoD, protocol dictates that any remaining funds after a certain time revert to the government as unclaimed property. That letter from 1960 we uncovered specifies precisely that. Clara leaned forward, voice firm. Your Honor, between 1957 and 1960, Mr. O'Malley traveled to Korean War veterans reunions, delivered humanitarian supplies, and supported local clinics. There's evidence of small donations he made to veteran groups in Rhode Island. These actions suggest he believed the trust was functioning, despite not knowing where the principal lay. Caprio nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, counsel. Let us proceed to the next witness, Sergeant Major David Kimball. As the bailiff escorted Kimball back to the stand, the courtroom buzzed with a mixture of skepticism and sympathy. Behind opaque tinted glass, a news camera whirred softly. Seamus leaned toward Clara. Do you think this is going well? He whispered. Clara squeezed his hand. We're revealing the full story, Seamus. That's all we needed. Kimball settled onto the stand, adjusting his veteran's pin. His presence was commanding. Broad shoulders, square jaw, and eyes that glinted with both severity and fondness whenever he looked at Seamus. Clara opened her folder. Sergeant Major Kimball, you and Mr. O'Malley served together in the 24th Infantry Division. Can you tell the court about the circumstances under which he obtained medical supplies outside official channels? Kimball nodded, voice resonant. In late 1952, our unit was cut off from standard supply lines. American medical convoys were rerouted elsewhere, and our platoon started running low on critical drugs, sulfa tablets, penicillin. O'Malley, as our medic, took it upon himself to find alternative sources. He negotiated with local NGOs and private donors in Japan. He used contact lists he'd built back home, philanthropists, church groups. He'd arrive at our makeshift aid stations with crates labeled medical relief, private donation. It saved dozens of lives. Clara interjected, "Sergeant Major, did you ever see Mr. O'Malley receive money for these supplies?" Kimball's gaze softened as he looked at Seamus. He would show up with these handwritten receipts, postmarked Tokyo or Seoul, signed by local pharmacists. But when he returned to base, he never used that money for himself. He'd hand me the receipts and say, "Keep this, Dave. We'll square it later." I assumed it was stored in some veteran care fund that would reimburse him when the war ended. Monroe rose, eyebrows arched. "Sergeant Major, did you have access to any of those funds yourself? Did you ever see Mr. O'Malley distribute money to anyone?" Kimball shook his head emphatically. "Number. The closest I saw was him purchasing medicine for local villagers suffering from dysentery and malaria. It wasn't for personal or unit consumption, it was humanitarian. He believed saving civilian lives helped our cause. If I had a dime, I'd bet it all on the notion that Seamus never took a penny for himself." Caprio leaned forward. "Sergeant Major, did Mr. O'Malley ever mention that he intended to keep records of all those expenses for the government's later reimbursement?" Kimball frowned slightly. "He mentioned he'd have to file reports after the war, but everyone assumed he'd submit expense forms once we got back to stateside. War corrals paperwork. By the time we evacuated in early '53, we lost track of most of those documents. O'Malley carried a field notebook. He made entries daily. Those notebook pages are Exhibit 8 and 9. They show names, amounts spent, and recipients in small clinics." Clara held up the notebooks, and the courtroom clerk passed them to Caprio. He briefly flipped through them, ink smudged in places, pages browned by mud and sweat. Judge Caprio addressed the gallery. "The notebooks provide a contemporaneous record of Mr. O'Malley's actions. That is powerful evidence." He then turned back to Kimball. "Sergeant Major, would you say Mr. O'Malley ever intended to defraud the government?" Kimball's expression hardened. "No, Your Honor. His only intent was to keep people alive. If he signed something incorrectly out of necessity, it was never with the intent of deception. I'd stake my second Purple Heart on that." Clara sat down, and Caprio nodded, looking at Monroe. "Anything further?" Monroe shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Caprio tapped his gavel lightly. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. You may step down." As Kimball descended, Caprio addressed the courtroom. "We will recess for a brief interlude. When we return, we will hear testimony from Dr. Marianne Tiagi about Mr. O'Malley's field journal. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. The gavel struck, and murmurs fluttered through the benches. In one cluster, an elderly couple whispered to each other, "I can't believe how much paperwork was lost in wartime." Across the aisle, a young paralegal tapped notes into a laptop. "Focus on letters 1954 to 1957 and their unanswered status." Seamus slumped back, fatigue etched into his features, while Clara consulted her notes with laser focus, preparing for the next segment. Outside the courtroom, reporters congregated, their cameras poised to capture every exit. Seamus's daughter, Mary, took her father's arm and whispered, "You did good in there, Dad." He smiled gently, though his eyes reflected the weight of decades of uncertainty. "I'm just tired," he replied. "But let's keep going. There's more to this story." Back inside, Judge Caprio surveyed the room before rising from his bench. "Court is back in session. Ms. Ortiz, please call your next witness." And so the day continued, testimony by testimony, exhibit by exhibit, gradually unfolding a complex tapestry of service, paperwork, and moral responsibility. Through each exchange, the tension between legal obligation and humanitarian impulse wove an intricate narrative that would ultimately shape the fate of an 82-year-old war hero turned defendant. Throughout every question, every objection, and every revelation, the courtroom held its breath, waiting to see how the scales of justice would balance between law and mercy. As the bailiff guided Dr. Marianne Tiagi to the witness stand, a hush settled over the courtroom. Dr. Tiagi, a medical historian with silver-streaked hair and a calm, thoughtful demeanor, carried in her hands a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and pages faintly yellowed. Her crisp white blouse and dark skirt gave her a scholarly presence, and as she settled into the chair, she placed the journal reverently on the stand before her. Every eye in the courtroom followed her measured movements. The weight of what she was about to reveal hung palpable in the air. Clara Ortiz rose smoothly from the defense table, her notepad in one hand and pen poised in the other. "Dr. Tiagi," she began, "could you please explain to the court what you have in your possession?" Dr. Tiagi's voice was gentle but clear. "This," she said, opening the journal carefully, "is the field journal of Private First Class Seamus O'Malley, spanning from August 1952 through December 1954. It contains daily entries of his activities, supplies requested, patients treated, expenses incurred, and, most importantly, notes about a young Korean girl named Min Suk, whom he treated in late 1952. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Caprio leaned forward, brows drawn. "Proceed, please." Dr. Tiagi turned a few pages, her fingers tracing the lines of faded ink. "On September 10, 1952, she read, PFC O'Malley wrote, "Monsoon rains have swallowed most of our supply lines. Without penicillin, these men will die. Today, I traveled under fire to a village clinic. Min Suk, age 7, is pallid from dysentery. No sulfa drugs remain. I approached a merchant in Ulsan who sold me a full course for $200, far more than market rate. I signed the government paperwork, thinking reimbursement would follow. However, I redirected every cent I had toward her care. If she dies, it will not be for lack of effort." The courtroom leaned in, the photograph of that very entry projected onto a monitor beside the bench. The grainy photograph of a small girl, cheeks sunken and eyes unfocused, stared out at them. Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears as she met Seamus's gaze. Even he, stoic until now, blinked rapidly, his lip trembling. Clara pressed on gently. "Dr. Tiagi, does the journal contain any further entries regarding Min Suk?" Dr. Tiagi nodded. "Yes. On September 13, 1952, he wrote, Min Suk's fever has broken. Her family wept tears of relief. They call me Ahjushi, which means uncle." I handed over the receipt, but there was no signature from the government official to confirm payment. I am still uncertain if I will see reimbursement. Regardless, this child's life was worth every penny. She paused, running a finger over the page. Then, on November 2, 1952, local Red Cross volunteer informed me that O'Malley Health Trust has been established in Tokyo to cover veterans' medical expenses. I believe this trust will handle the finances, but I must send a letter to the Department of Defense. I will ask for instructions on how to allocate funds to veteran care. A ripple of emotion passed across Seamus's face. He lifted a hand to his temple, closing his eyes as though hearing those distant voices again. Clara knelt beside him for a moment, offering silent support. When she rose, she addressed Dr. Tiagi. "Were there subsequent letters, Doctor?" Dr. Tiagi opened another section. On October 3, 1957, he wrote, "Sir, 3 years have passed since my last inquiry. I continue to serve my country as a postal clerk, yet the funds in the O'Malley Health Trust have multiplied. I write again to ask for guidance on transferring what remains to support disabled veterans. My family struggles on my salary, and I cannot bear the thought of these funds lying dormant while former comrades suffer." She looked up, her expression tracing the courtroom. No response to that letter appears, no official acknowledgement, no directives. After that, his journal entries become sparse about the financial matters, focusing instead on veterans' reunions, occasional charitable outings, and brief notes about his work as a medic in civilian clinics. Judge Caprio nodded gravely. "Thank you, Dr. Tyagi. No further questions from the defense?" Clara shook her head. Monroe stood, straightening his jacket. "Dr. Tyagi, is it not true that these journal entries demonstrate Mr. O'Malley's knowledge of a trust bearing his name, intended, or at least implied, to benefit veteran care?" Dr. Tyagi met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir. He believed so, hence his letters seeking instruction." Monroe pressed on. "Yet he did not follow up after 1957 when no reply came. Is that correct?" Dr. Tyagi inhaled. "The entries show that after his last letter, he continued to dedicate time to fundraising events and veteran charities. He believed the trust was functioning, though he admitted confusion as to the exact distribution. He did not know the accounts remained passive." Monroe nodded. "So you agree that Mr. O'Malley could have discovered the trust was still in his name at any point between 1957 and 2018, but failed to act?" Dr. Tyaghi's lips pressed together. "The context suggests he assumed the government was administering the trust. There is no evidence he personally verified the balance until the Unclaimed Property Division notified him in 2018. Monroe frowned, but did not argue further. As Dr. Tyagi stepped down, PFC Samuel Chen, age 78, was called to testify. Chen shuffled to the stand, leaning on a cane. His uniform was folded neatly and displayed proudly in a glass case beside him. He cleared his throat, voice quivering but resolute. Clara guided him kindly, then withdrew to her seat. "PFC Chen," Clara began, "how did you know Mr. O'Malley?" Chen adjusted his cap, looking directly at Seamus. "He was the medic assigned to my squad at Heartbreak Ridge. We were pinned down for days, no supplies, no reinforcements. I was struck by shrapnel in my left thigh. It was Private O'Malley who patched me, kept me conscious with morphine until they could get me out. He never once mentioned payment. He just said, 'Save your scream for the crisis, soldier.'" Monroe rose, eyes narrowed. "PFC Chen, are you telling this court that Mr. O'Malley purchased morphine on his own accord?" Chen nodded, gaze steady. "He'd slip off post at night, trek half a mile to a Japanese military field hospital. I remember him describing how he paid for the drugs out of pocket. Or so I thought. He handed the receipts to me. Japanese script I couldn't read. I thought they were for supplies to save our lives." Monroe shifted in his seat. Clara asked softly, "Did Mr. O'Malley ever discuss how he financed these purchases?" Chen's lips trembled. "He never said. I assumed the medicines were free, but I still have the receipts, if it helps." He reached into his pocket and handed a yellowed envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Inside were crude photocopies of pharmacy bills dated November 15, 1952, listing penicillin and morphine with a price of 300 yen, far more than local market value. Judge Caprio frowned as he reviewed the receipts. "Mr. Chen, did you ever see Mr. O'Malley deposit money into his own account during or after the war?" Chen shook his head emphatically. "Hell no. The man lived on rations and hummed hymns to keep himself calm. He gave all he had to others. Tears welled in his eyes. Judge Caprio looked toward Seamus, whose chest heaved with emotion. Clara stood and lowered her voice. "PFC Chen, if you had never received those medicines, would you be here today?" He sniffled. "I'd be dead, Your Honor, probably frozen in a trench somewhere." A hush fell again. Monroe attempted to redirect. "PFC Chen, do you have any proof that Mr. O'Malley did not bill those expenses to the Department of Defense?" Chen's eyes flared. "The man told me he filed paperwork, something he called a government receipt. He said the trust would take care of it. He trusted someone else to handle the money. I never saw him lie, sir." Monroe clenched his jaw but conceded. Judge Caprio nodded to Chen. "Thank you. You may step down." As Chen walked back, Clara crouched beside Seamus and whispered something inaudible. He smiled through tears, nodding gratefully. Silence settled once more. Judge Caprio leaned forward, pressing his hands gently on the bench. "The court will take a brief recess before proceeding to closing arguments. This testimony has illuminated aspects of intent and context that are crucial to our understanding of this case. We will reconvene in 10 minutes." He tapped his gavel, and a soft echo resounded through the cavernous chamber. The audience murmured as they filed out, many pausing to exchange hushed remarks about what they had heard. An old man's compassion warping into decades of financial confusion, the memories of a child saved in a war-torn village, the unintended consequences of bureaucratic silence. Seamus remained seated, head bowed, absorbing the magnitude of these revelations. Clara stood by his side, offering a gentle hand on his shoulder. Outside the courtroom, cameras blinked, capturing every expression, some showing sympathy, others skepticism. Yet beneath them all lay a profound sense that the case had transcended mere numbers on a ledger. It had become a testament to sacrifice, misunderstanding, and the durable power of human empathy. As the recess bell rang, the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind a sense of suspended destiny. 5 minutes later, Judge Caprio returned, already seated, his expression calm but alert. He adjusted his glasses and looked at each table, acknowledging the gravity of what had transpired. The emotional twist had been laid bare. A man once celebrated for his courage, now standing accused of hiding a fortune from the very nation he served. But for every moment of accusation, there had been an equal pulse of humanity resurrected by his own words and the voices of those who stood by him. Now, the court would proceed to weigh that humanity against the letter of the law. Dr. Marianne Tiagi settled into the witness chair, holding a weathered leather-bound journal as if cradling something sacred. The courtroom's lights seemed to dim around her, focusing attention on the fragile volume. As she opened its cover, a hush fell. Everyone sensed that within those pages lay the key to understanding not just the ledger entries, but the heart of the man before them. Her voice, gentle yet unwavering, carried through the chamber. "This is Seamus O'Malley's field journal from August 1952 to December 1954. She flipped to a stained page dated September 10th, 1952. Here, he recounts traveling under mortar fire to reach a makeshift clinic in rural Ulsan. He writes of finding a 7-year-old girl named Min Suk, emaciated and feverish from dysentery. No antibiotics remained in the base's supplies. He paid a local merchant an exorbitant sum, 300 yen, for penicillin. He signed a receipt provided by that merchant, trusting reimbursement would follow. Then he wrote, "I will not leave her to die for lack of medicine." He transferred every yen from his meager salary toward her care. As Dr. Tiagi read, the image of a young Korean child, pale and clinging to life, seemed to flicker across the courtroom's collective memory. Seamus shifted in his seat, shoulders trembling, as though transported back to that rain-soaked hillside. The gallery leaned forward, breath caught in throats. On November 2nd, 1952, continued Dr. Tyagi, turning another page, he notes receiving word that a trust, O'Malley Health Trust, was established in Tokyo to cover veterans' medical expenses. Yet, he writes of confusion. I sent letters to the Department of Defense asking for guidance on dispersing any surplus to veteran care. No reply has come. Her fingers trace the faded ink. After that, entries shift focus, brief notes about treating soldiers, attending reunions, and small donations to local clinics. The financial details fade into the background, overshadowed by the urgency of lives saved. A tremulous silence hung for a moment before Clara Ortiz rose to inquire, Dr. Tyagi, does the journal reveal whether Mr. O'Malley ever felt guilt or regret over these transactions? Dr. Tyagi closed her eyes briefly, then replied, he writes on December 15th, 1954, I carry memories of faces I saved and faces I could not. If these funds helped one life, I sleep easier. But I remain uncertain if the government sees this as service or sin. When Dr. Tyagi stepped down, an elderly veteran, Private First Class Samuel Chen, was called. Leaning on a polished wooden cane, he climbed the stand with deliberate reverence. His voice, gravelly with age, resonated. I was shot at Heartbreak Ridge in November '52. Seamus patched my wound, whispered, hold on, kid, help is coming. I woke up in a field hospital because he had slipped out at night, bought morphine and penicillin on his own dime, or so I thought. He handed me Korean pharmacy receipts, telling me not to worry about cost. I believed those were donations. I didn't know they bore his signature. Several rows of spectators wiped their eyes. Seamus clasped his hands together, head bowed. Clara approached him quietly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. The weight of decades, the lives saved and the funds spent, unfolded in stark relief. In that moment, everyone grasped the truth. These were not cold financial transactions, but acts of compassion under fire, driven by a man whose only currency was empathy. As PFC Chen concluded, the courtroom buzzed with the gravity of realization. Seamus O'Malley's wartime sacrifice had woven moral complexity into facts and figures. The ledger entries were not mere records of overpayment. They were echoes of a young medic's vow to preserve life at any cost. And it was this emotional truth that would test the justice of Judge Caprio's impartial scales. The courtroom fell into a hush as Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly steepled before him. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting soft amber light across the polished wood. He gazed at Seamus O'Malley seated below. The old man's posture had grown rigid with anticipation, as though each breath carried decades of burden. Around him, attorneys and spectators waited, their collective expectation palpable. In this moment, Judge Caprio was not merely arbiter of the law, but custodian of a moral quandary that had been unfolding for more than 70 years. From the moment Agent Caldwell had described the chain of ledgers and trusts, to Dr. Tyagi's reading of that dusty journal page, to PFC Chen's trembling remembrance of the battlefield night when Seamus procured morphine at his own expense, the facts had formed a tapestry woven with threads of compassion and confusion. Caprio felt the weight of those threads tug at the very heart of justice. The law itself might look upon an unclaimed trust, hundreds of millions accrued through compound interest, with clear directives, return that money to the United States Treasury. Yet the ledger entries represented more than mere numbers. They symbolized a medic's vow to spare lives, a childhood saved from the ravages of dysentery, and a lifetime of uncertainty born of bureaucratic silence. Leaning forward, Caprio allowed himself a moment of private reflection. though his voice carried clearly enough that those closest could catch its low resonance. "When Private O'Malley signed those receipts," he murmured, "he believed he was acting in concert with his oath as a soldier and as a human being. The field hospital in Ulsan was starving for resources. He paid 300 yen for penicillin, not to enrich himself, but to nurse a girl's fragile body. He saw that trust as a mechanism to secure future supplies for his comrades and for civilian clinics. Yet page after page in that journal revealed a man caught between duty and confusion. He asked the Department of Defense to instruct him, but the letters went unanswered. So, he saved lives, driven by compassion, all the while allowing that trust to expand until it became something far larger than a vetting fund for wartime medicine." His gaze drifted upward toward the gallery benches. A young couple sat quietly, exchanging glances tinged with empathy. A few reporters clicked pens, trying to capture every nuance of his expression. The tension between legal obligation and moral conscience swirled like dust motes in the rays of sunlight. Caprio weighed that tension, recalling another case from years before, two young brothers on trial for running a makeshift clinic in a corner of rural Rhode Island, providing free medical care to undocumented immigrants. They, too, had skirted regulations in the name of compassion. He had acquitted them, concluding that the rigid application of the law must sometimes yield to a higher ethic of mercy. This case was not identical, but it resonated with the same question. Does justice demand unyielding adherence to statutes, or does justice require that we step beyond the black ink of codes and enter the gray space where humanity resides? Clearing his throat, Caprio spoke, allowing the courtroom to follow his thought. "Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at the crossroads of law and mercy. The statutes decree that unclaimed property, funds held in trust for more than 3 years, must revert to the federal government. By that measure, Mr. O'Malley's fortunes belong to the United States. Yet this is not a standard contract dispute between two corporations. It is the story of a young medic whose only desire was to see his fellow soldiers and affected civilians survive. He wrote of a child named Min Suk, her life saved by his urgent actions. He spent what little money he had, trusting a system that never provided clear guidance. When that system failed, the money proliferated unseen, until it overshadowed his modest wage as a postal clerk. Now, decades later, we ask, should that money return to the government in full, or should part of it be recognized as repayment for a debt owed to a nation for lives saved? His voice grew quieter still, as if voicing an internal struggle. Does the law have the capacity to honor both duty and sacrifice? Or does the letter of the law insist that sacrifice, once recorded as overpayment, irrevocably becomes a debt that must now be paid? We must remember that this man, now 82 years of age, has lived as a hero to the men he treated, and as a stranger under indictment to the very government he served. His calls for guidance in 1954 and 1957 were met with silence. In that silence, the trust became a phantom, guiding his actions, yet eluding accountability until decades later. How do we reconcile his intentions with the law's demand for restitution? Caprio paused, looking at Seamus directly. The old man's face was etched with lines, each wrinkle a testament to hardship, hope, or regret. His eyes glistened with restrained tears. Caprio noted the handwritten journal passes, the cemetery of receipts, the vacant stares of grateful veterans at reunions, and the months he spent sending inquiries overseas. All of these constituted a moral ledger that could not simply be dismissed. Turning back to face the gallery, Caprio allowed a brief nod toward the jury, even though it was a bench trial. His words rang with quiet decisiveness. We must also consider the precedent we set. If a man's good faith effort to save lives inadvertently breaches a contract, do we punish him retroactively for choosing compassion in the heat of chaos? Or do we acknowledge that the law's architecture sometimes fails the people it is meant to protect? We cannot ignore the possibility that countless others received similar overpayments, that many stood in O'Malley's boots, making life and death decisions without fully understanding the financial ramifications. He straightened, inclining slightly toward both counsel tables. In my chambers, I have wrestled with these questions. Is it just to require an elderly veteran to return every penny of a trust that was, in essence, his only recourse to ensure life-saving supplies reach the front lines? Or does justice demand that he make amends for every dollar, regardless of motive? The fundamental principle of our legal system is accountability, yet it is tempered by the recognition that human actions are often guided by necessity and compassion. Caprio's steepled fingers then pressed lightly against his lips, his gaze seeking clarity. He addressed the attorneys. "You have presented compelling evidence. Miss Ortiz, you have shown the profound moral imperative that guided Mr. O'Malley's wartime actions. Mr. Monroe, you have established the government's rightful claim to unclaimed property. Each argument stands on firm ground. But above all, I must decide how to balance these truths: a nation's need to reclaim its assets, and a man's lifetime of service and sacrifice. In doing so, I am reminded that the law exists to serve justice, not to overshadow it. I will reflect on these matters carefully, and my ruling will attempt to honor both the letter of the law and the spirit of humanity that gave rise to these funds." As he broke the silence, lowering his gaze toward the bench notes, the courtroom remained still. No one dared speak, for in that silence lay the weight of a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of the Providence courthouse. Each mind present would recall this moment: the judge, wrestling with mercy and ordinance; the defendant, waiting to learn whether his sacrifices would be met with condemnation or compassion; and the spectators, witnessing the fragile intersection of law and the human heart. A hush fell over the courtroom as Clara Ortiz rose again, her grip on a thick folder betraying the importance of what she held. Seamus O'Malley sat forward, his lined face drawn taut with anticipation. The prosecution table stiffened. Even Agent Caldwell, seated nearby, glanced over her shoulder. Judge Caprio leaned forward, pen poised, ready to record what would undoubtedly shift the case's trajectory. Clara approached the bench with measured steps. "Your Honor, the defense would like to submit a previously undisclosed Department of Defense memo dated July 15, 1960. She handed the document to the bailiff, who carefully passed it to the judge. All eyes followed as Caprio scanned the typewritten half-page. The heading read, "Directive 17. B. Reversion of unclaimed funds, credited to Seamus O'Malley. Action required." Underneath were terse instructions. Per 1957 correspondence from PFC O'Malley, unclaimed balances in the O'Malley Health Trust must revert to the United States. No disbursement to veteran programs has been recorded. All accounts should be closed and funds recovered. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Seamus's shoulders slackened as if a burden had momentarily lifted. Clara met Caprio's gaze. "Your Honor, this establishes that as early as 1960, the department intended to reclaim these funds. Mr. O'Malley's letters of 1954 and 1957 sought guidance, yet the DoD's internal directive indicates they assumed no further action was required on his part. They believed the trust itself would lapse and revert automatically. There is no indication they attempted to communicate this directive to Mr. O'Malley or his legal representatives." Judge Caprio raised an eyebrow and turned a page. He glanced toward the prosecution table. Timothy Monroe rose slowly. "Your Honor, if I may respond, this memo confirms our position that the funds belong to the government. However, it does not negate the fact that Mr. O'Malley benefited from these funds over 6 decades. The memo merely outlines procedure. It does not erase the debt." Caprio looked back at Clara. Ms. Ortiz, do you have evidence that this memo was never sent, received, or otherwise communicated to Mr. O'Malley? Clara nodded, gathering her composure. Yes, Your Honor. We have testimony from a retired Air Force records clerk, Ms. Evelyn Rogers, who served in the Office of Finance in 1960. We subpoenaed her this morning. Ms. Rogers will confirm that although the memo was drafted and filed, it was never transmitted due to a clerical oversight. In effect, the department never informed Mr. O'Malley of the need to return the funds. The judge inclined his head. Let's hear from Ms. Rogers, then. The bailiff called her forward. She climbed the witness stand, adjusting her blazer. Though in her 80s, her posture remained military straight, a relic of her decades in service. Caprio offered a gentle invitation. Ms. Rogers, please state your role in 1960. She cleared her throat, voice steady but tinged with regret. I was a finance clerk at the DoD in 1960. My responsibilities included processing memos of unclaimed property, tracking them through internal databases, and ensuring their dispatch to relevant departments. In July of that year, I logged Directive 17B into the system, mandating that Mr. O'Malley's trust be reverted. However, before the memo could be forwarded to the Providence office or to his last known address, I was transferred to another division. In the shuffle, the directive was misfiled under dormant trusts and never sent. A tremor ran through Seamus's body. Clara offered a reassuring nod, while Monroe shifted uneasily. Caprio gently pressed. Ms. Rogers, did you ever become aware of this oversight before today? She shook her head, sorrow clouding her eyes. No, Your Honor. I only discovered it during a review of my personal files earlier this year, when Ms. Ortiz's team contacted me. Until then, I believed the directive had been acted upon as intended. Caprio's pen hovered over his notes. And, to your knowledge, no successor clerk ever corrected or transmitted the memo? Ms. Rogers folded her fingers. Correct, Your Honor. The filing error remained unnoticed for decades. It was not until this case triggered a full audit that the misfile was uncovered. Monroe rose, brow furrowed. Your Honor, are we to believe that the DoD, an agency of vast resources, simply lost track of a memo for 60 years? This seems implausible. Caprio's gaze remained steady as he addressed Monroe. Mr. Monroe, while it is regrettable, the evidence before the court shows that a clerical misfiling did indeed occur. Whether the DoD's size should preclude human error is not for this court to decide. We must assess the facts as they stand. Monroe hesitated before returning to his seat. The courtroom absorbed the gravity of Ms. Rogers's testimony. The entire government apparatus had failed to notify Seamus of his obligation, leaving him in prolonged ignorance. Clara rose to emphasize the implication. Your Honor, in light of this oversight, it is patently unfair to hold my client fully accountable for funds he believed were managed appropriately by his own government. He acted in good faith, relying on the department's administrative competence. The memo's existence, uncommunicated, changes our understanding of Mr. O'Malley's intention and the nature of his responsibility. In response, Agent Caldwell offered a measured statement. Your Honor, while the oversight is regrettable, it does not negate the fact that the funds legally reverted to the United States in 1960. Mr. O'Malley's lack of awareness does not eliminate the government's claim. However, given the circumstances, I do support a nuanced resolution, especially since he did attempt to contact the DoD previously. The lack of official response compounds Mr. O'Malley's confusion. Caprio nodded, steepling his fingers once more. Very well. We will enter Directive 17B as Exhibit 12 and Ms. Rogers's testimony as Exhibit 13. This evidence is crucial in understanding both intent and procedural lapse. I will consider it carefully in crafting my judgment. He paused before turning to Monroe. "Are there any further witnesses or documents that either side wishes to introduce for this phase of the trial?" Monroe shook his head. "No, Your Honor. The prosecution rests." Clara gathered her notes. "The defense has no further witnesses, Your Honor." Judge Caprio tapped the gavel lightly. "Then we have reached a turning point in this case. The introduction of Directive 17. B has illuminated that the Department of Defense, through no fault of Mr. O'Malley, failed to notify him of his obligation to return the funds. This revelation compels us to re-examine the balance between legal obligation and equitable justice. We will proceed to closing arguments so that both counsel may address how this newly uncovered evidence should inform the final judgment." As the courtroom buzzed with subdued conversation, Seamus exhaled, his posture relaxing for the first time in days. Clara offered him a brief, encouraging smile. The jury, or rather, the bench, had witnessed the moment when evidence shifted the narrative. The scales of justice were no longer tipping solely toward the government's claim. They now weighed the heavy consequences of bureaucratic error against a lifelong legacy of service and sacrifice. In that charged silence, everyone present felt the unmistakable shift. This case was no longer just about dollars and cents, but about the fragile trust between a veteran and his country. Judge Caprio took a deep breath and rose from the bench, allowing the courtroom to settle into an attentive hush. He folded his hands on the polished wood surface and regarded Seamus O'Malley with a mixture of compassion and solemnity. For the past hour, the court had examined meticulous records, ledgers, trust documents, testimonies about misfiled memos, and heartfelt recollections of a medic's battlefield efforts. Now, all those facts converged toward a single moment of decision, one that would determine how the law and mercy would intertwine in this unique case. "Seamus O'Malley," Caprio began, his voice measured but warm, "you stand before this court accused of concealing, and in technical terms, withholding, funds originally credited to you as a result of your wartime services. By the strict letter of the law, unclaimed property held in trust for more than 3 years reverts to the United States. Yet, this case transcends a mere contractual dispute. It rests upon the fundamental question of whether the circumstances under which those funds were accrued and subsequently allowed to grow justify a departure from absolute restitution." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Seamus sat forward, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the defense table. His eyes, once bright with the eager expectation of a veteran recounting his deeds, now glistened with tears unfallen. Clara Ortiz, Seamus's attorney, leaned in, but Caprio's gaze remained steady on the defendant. "From 1952 to 1954, during the Korean conflict, you, Mr. O'Malley, acted as a battlefield medic when your unit's official supply lines collapsed. Facing shortages of antibiotics and painkillers, you personally negotiated with local merchants, at times paying exorbitant sums, to procure life-saving medicine. Your own diary entries describe rushing through monsoon rains to save Min Suk, a 7-year-old girl, from a fever so high that standard treatments were unavailable. You wrote, 'I will not leave her to die for lack of medicine.' Those statements reveal a compassion that transcends duty." Caprio's gaze swept the courtroom, lawyers, spectators, even the reporters whose pens had stilled. "Your expenditures were documented, but your intentions were obscured by wartime chaos. You trusted that the O'Malley Health Trust, established in Tokyo, would manage those funds responsibly. Yet, when you sought guidance from the Department of Defense in 1954 and again in 1957, your letters went unanswered. Meanwhile, the trust, neglected and dormant, expanded exponentially over decades, reaching nearly $100 million. Only in 2018 did you receive a notice. It was then you learned, for the first time, that the funds remained tied to your name. Until that moment, you never knowingly received or used those earnings. Seamus's shoulders sagged as if absorbing an unseen weight. Clara glanced up at Caprio, her expression hopeful, while Monroe in the prosecution's corner pressed his lips together. Caprio continued. In July 1960, Directive 17B was written, instructing that unclaimed balances in the O'Malley Health Trust revert to the United States. However, that directive was misfiled and never sent. In lay terms, the Department of Defense failed to inform you of your obligation. You remained under the belief that the trust operated as it should, that the government was overseeing those assets. The absence of communication for nearly 6 decades placed you in prolonged uncertainty. He allowed a moment's silence before addressing the broader implications. We must consider the principle underlying our judicial system. The law is meant to serve justice, not to create injustice by rigidly applying rules without regard for human context. If I were to order the full restitution of $100 million, I would fulfill the letter of unclaimed property statutes. Yet, I would simultaneously inflict hardship on a man whose only misstep was trusting unspoken processes, a man whose life has already been dedicated to saving others. He has spent the better part of 7 decades in good faith actions, offering his service as a postal clerk, supporting veterans' causes, and living modestly on a government pension. Caprio's eyes softened as they returned to Seamus. Therefore, I conclude that returning all of the funds would be neither just nor compassionate. Instead, I find it appropriate that you, Mr. O'Malley, remit only the portion of the trust that accrued after 2018, the year you were explicitly notified of its existence and had the means to clarify its status. That sum, calculated at approximately $250,000, will be returned to the United States Treasury within 30 days. You may coordinate with the Treasury's Unclaimed Property Division to ensure a transparent transfer. No interest, no penalties, and no additional fines shall apply. This addresses the government's need to reclaim what is rightfully theirs post-notification, while acknowledging that prior to 2018, you acted under reasonable belief and without malice. Caprio paused one final time, as if ensuring that every word resonated. Regarding the remaining balance, the funds accrued before your awareness in 2018, I hereby declare them forfeit to the extent that they were expended on charitable or veteran-related causes in good faith. Those expenditures carry the weight of your service and will remain unaffected by this judgment. In sum, we strike a balance. The law claims what it may after proper notice, but it does not punish honest mistakes born of bureaucratic silence. A gentle exhale seemed to ripple through the courtroom. Seamus's expression shifted from apprehension to profound relief. Clara placed a supportive hand on his arm as he rose to his feet, his old frame trembling with gratitude. Even Monroe nodded slowly, acknowledging the measured fairness of the ruling. Caprio's final directive was practical and humane. Mr. O'Malley, this court extends its gratitude for your service and your integrity. You may now depart with your reputation intact. Let this judgment stand as a reminder that justice must hold both firm to the law and tender toward those who served it. He tapped the gavel with a soft but decisive strike. Court is adjourned. As the gavel's echo faded, Seamus stepped forward to embrace Clara. The gallery erupted into applause, a rare occurrence in courtroom proceedings. Judge Caprio quietly stepped down, observing the scene with a gentle smile, knowing that in this decision he had honored both the law's demands and the enduring spirit of human compassion. As the final echoes of the gavel faded, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted from tension to reflection. Judge Caprio's ruling had balanced legal duty with a profound respect for Seamus O'Malley's sacrifices, but the broader significance of this case was just beginning to unfold. Across Providence and beyond, people began to grasp the lessons hidden within the trial's details. News outlets highlighted how a simple clerical error had allowed a Department of Defense memo to vanish for decades, revealing how even powerful institutions can falter. Veteran organizations held town halls to discuss the case, emphasizing that every veteran deserves clear communication regarding entitlements and benefits. Attorneys and lawmakers cited the ruling as a catalyst for reform. New policies would require more rigorous follow-up procedures whenever veterans requested information about unclaimed funds or benefits. In classrooms at local universities, professors of law and ethics dissected the case, using it to spark debates about judicial discretion versus statutory obligation. Students argued that the ruling illustrated the necessity of mercy in justice, while others pointed out that allowing any funds to remain with Mr. O'Malley could set a troublesome precedent. Yet, all agreed that the trial underscored how the human stories behind legal disputes must inform our understanding of right and wrong. Meanwhile, at veterans' centers across Rhode Island, former soldiers shared their own narrow escapes and acts of compassion, stories mirroring Seamus's experiences. Many confessed they hadn't known that unclaimed property statutes applied to soldiers making life-or-death decisions in wartime. Now, they planned to review their own records, ensuring that no other veteran remained in the dark about assets tied to their service. In Seamus's hometown, a small scholarship fund was established in his name, directed toward young medics pursuing careers in humanitarian relief. His former battlefield comrade, Private First Class Samuel Chen, dedicated a plaque at the local VA clinic in honor of Seamus O'Malley, soldier, medic, and friend. Min Suk, the Korean girl he saved, visited via video call, expressing gratitude that rippled across multiple continents. Judge Caprio's closing reflection, "Justice without compassion can become tyranny, and compassion without responsibility can become chaos," was quoted in editorials nationwide. Legal journals published articles about the case, recommending standardized tracking for any government-issued directives involving veterans. Even the Department of Defense publicly acknowledged the error, pledging to strengthen its record-keeping and communication protocols. By the end of the 8th week after the trial, the real victory was clear. This courtroom drama had transcended the specifics of one ledger to remind a broader audience that behind every contract, every memo, and every statute lies a human life deserving of dignity. And in honoring both law and compassion, the community reaffirmed its commitment to those who serve. Now, thank you for witnessing Seamus's story. If this trial resonated with you, share your thoughts. Did justice prevail? Like this video to support compassionate storytelling, and subscribe to our channel for more courtroom dramas exploring the human side of the law. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new episode. Join the conversation always and share your perspective, helping us highlight the power of empathy in justice. Today,